Welcome back to the Health Bridge. Pedram here. Today, talking about DNA with Dr. Sharon Moalem. He's a medical doctor, he's a geneticist, he's an inventor, he's a researcher, a very, very interesting gentleman, and is doing some fascinating work in the realm of DNA and what we can do to actually change the way we live and the way we can express. So, hey, welcome to the show, Doc.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So how did you get into genetics in the first place? I mean, it's a fascinating subject. I'm assuming in your studies you got into it?
Yeah, I did actually. Originally, I studied insects and plants and looked at all the genetic factors behind what happens when they get sick and how they fight infections, and took a very long road academically to eventually study what happens in humans as well. And then, of course, through medicine and rare diseases.
Yeah, so when we talk about genetics nowadays, the biggest buzzword out there is epigenetics, and you could do this, you could do that, and it seems like everyone talks about epigenetics the way kind of new age people talk about quantum, right? And so a lot of people who don't understand genetics are talking about it very freely and loosely. So here we are, we got a super expert on the subject, and you have a book coming out called The DNA Restart, and there are 5 pillars in the book. I've had a chance to just kind of glance through it and glean some of the wisdom. The first one is for some the hardest one, which is eat right for your genes. And you unpack what that means. And I'd love to hear from you why eating and eating right for the genes is important.
Sure. Well, it's crucial. So for the last, longer than now 50 years, we've had this concept of one diet fits all. And slowly through genetics and sequencing the genome and looking around the world, we realized that the biggest actually difference genetically between populations and individuals is genes that are involved in the way in which we break down food. And this makes a lot of sense because if you look at all of our ancestors, they came from different parts of the world and they would do very different things to acquire their food. Some were doing intensive farming in the last 5,000 years, intensively farming cereal grains, while others were keeping animals and using their milk and milk products to survive. And of course, this had a big pressure on their genetics, and their genetics end up matching what they were eating. And what we've actually seen, and the example that I use in the book, which is the most straightforward one when it comes to genetics and diet, is the ability to have dairy products and to digest lactose, the sugar found in milk. And so most people on the planet actually don't have the genetics to do this. But if their ancestors kept animals, drank their milk, and ate those products, they inherited a mutation that allowed them to do this. And so I looked to see, would there be something else that would be useful for us? And the big one is a gene that codes for an enzyme called amylase. And this enzyme's in all of our saliva. And what it does is it breaks down the starch in the foods that we're eating. But some of us have inherited only 2 copies of these genes, one from each parent, while others have inherited almost 24 or more than even 20. And so when you look at that, you ask, well, what's the reason for it? And the reason is this gene helps to break down the starch that is in a heavy cereal-based diet. So if your ancestors were doing a lot of intensive farming, you're eating a lot of cereal grains, you'll have an extra dose of these genes to be able to break down that starch. And this is really important because as a recent study actually confirmed, having those genes allows you to break down that starch without having a spike in your glucose. But eating exactly the same diet and not having those genes results in a very high glucose spike and then a risk factor, as researchers now have shown, for diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and obesity. And so this might help explain for a lot of people who've been struggling trying the certain diet that's worked for someone else and doesn't really work for them, and the real reason behind that is genetic. And so I went ahead and said, besides doing a genetic test, which might open you up to genetic discrimination, and there's an expensive course associated with it, how can I do a functional genetic test? How can I, investigate or interrogate a certain part of the body? And of course, it's the saliva. And this sounds almost too simple. It's very straightforward. You actually chew on a saltine cracker, and if you have problems with gluten, you can just use a piece of raw potato. And if you have enough amylase, that enzyme, enough of those genes that I was just mentioning in your saliva, it'll break down the starch while you're chewing, and you'll notice a change in taste. And if you do, then I've broken the population down to three major categories. If you notice a fast change within 14 seconds, you're in the high carb category. And that means your ancestors had a lot of carbohydrates that they were taking in, and then you have the genetics and the physiology to deal with that diet. And that's up to about 50% carbohydrates. If it takes a bit longer for a taste change, from 14 to 30 seconds, you're moderate. And so instead of the 50% carbohydrate intake that you can in the high carb category, you're down to 35. And if you didn't experience any taste change at all, you're in the carbohydrate restricted category. And that probably means that your ancestors weren't doing intensive farming. They didn't have exposure to a lot of cereal grains. And that's in the more carbohydrate restricted category of about 25% carbohydrate intake.
So you mentioned genetic discrimination. There are people that are really afraid of this now. So, I mean, there's 23andMe, there's all these tests out there that people in the community are out there doing. This fear of being profiled and using that information against you, this is a real fear, and you're seeing this out in the community?
Yeah, it is. And so there is some federal legislation, the acronym for the law is called GINA, which protects you in cases of employment and medical care, medical insurance, discrimination in those two categories. But it's wide open and state by state protection for life insurance and disability, the two most important things. And so it's really unclear because this, of course, genetics now, this field is so new and wide open. So getting testing done will definitely open people up to that kind of discrimination. We just don't know how far and wide. And actually, for the first time in medical history, it's not just personal discrimination, it's familial. Because if you find a gene that predisposes you, say, to cancer syndromes, your family's at risk for that genetic discrimination without even undergoing the test. So as I've done many times in the past with patients and colleagues and family, is really advise them to, if they're thinking of getting any genetic testing done, to do it anonymously.
Yeah, so you could avoid it by taking a saltine cracker, or if you're gluten sensitive, raw potato, putting it in your mouth. If it unlocks the sweetness in the first few seconds, then you're good to go. If you're in the middle area, then look at that. And if you don't taste any sweet, then maybe you shouldn't be eating carbs like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's pretty straightforward in that sense. And when I say functional genetics, the reason it's interesting, because we often, and you were mentioning when we started the show regarding epigenetics, this is also an example of an epigenetic effect, because you can have certain genes, but you don't know how they behave. So you can have a certain number of amylase genes that you've inherited. Actually, you can think of identical twins that inherit the same number, yet they can have different levels of the enzyme in their saliva, and they can be behaving differently as well. And so that's like an epigenetic effect that's testable and usable, and you do that by testing the actual saliva.
Got it. So this is on the front end, and this is kind of one of the pieces that a lot of people in the community have been really pushing on in saying, look, you got to chew your food, The amylase is there for a reason, and most people just inhale their food, and that's kind of the front end of the digestive process. What about the other side? I mean, are you guys looking at any of the kind of bacterial genetics and any of the things that would help break down with the gut microbiome and how that affects us in health?
Yes, and so I'm glad you brought that up, and it's something that that when I started looking into it, and now I'm getting more concerned as more data comes out, and that has to do with the issue of emulsifiers in our food. And so these are a group of chemicals that have been used in the last 50 years in a lot of baked goods. So anything that you want to kind of help dough stick together, and if you don't want to do the proper baking and fermentation process, if you want to speed it up, you add these detergent-like emulsifiers, and they've also been used when you want to cut out fat from food. So any low-fat dairy, they use emulsifiers to help kind of glue the food together. And what research now is showing that these emulsifiers, which have a detergent-like property, so it's almost like eating soap if you think about it, they strip down the mucus lining in the gut, and that not only changes the resident microbiota that live there, it brings them very close to our tissue. And when that happens, that causes a low-grade inflammation. And what research now has shown, at least that's been done in mice, is that mice that are given a very low dose of emulsifiers, it's 10 to 20 times less than what an average person might be exposed to just eating a normal diet, they not only had low-grade inflammation, they actually found themselves these mice found themselves very hungry and were overeating. So they became obese. Some of them became pre-diabetic. And a small percentage of the mice that were susceptible to gut inflammation went on even to develop colitis. So like a full-blown inflammatory bowel disease. And this is actually what we've been seeing in the last 50 years with a lot of people having issue with the food that they've been eating, especially with the rising tide of people who are experiencing problems with gluten. And so what my research actually has been showing very clearly now is that it may not just be the gluten, but these emulsifiers that are in our food. And unfortunately, a lot of gluten-free food actually contains more emulsifiers than food that had gluten in the first place. But to remove all these remove all these emulsifiers from the diet, the low-grade inflammation is thought to take about 2 months to resolve before you can go back to eating a normal diet. And the way I was first exposed to this, I had a lot of colleagues actually that had sensitivities to gluten while they were living in America, would travel overseas and cheat essentially and have a Parisian baguette and expect the worst, and actually nothing would happen. And so they'd come back to the US, wait a week or two and try the same thing again, and then they find themselves getting sick. And part of the issue is when they were trying to find out, and I was helping them sort out what was actually going on, many of these emulsifiers actually don't even have to be listed in the ingredients. And so they're being used and they're very hard to avoid. So I really encourage people to go back to kind of skipping a lot of the processed foods that may have these emulsifiers. And if you want to try and reintroducing gluten into your diet, to do it really from a home-baked recipe.
So there's a couple pieces to this that are fascinating. One is you're saying it takes 2 months. And so most people will try a diet if they're not feeling better within 3, 4, 5 days. They're like, forget about it, this didn't work. And so there needs to be a longer game here. You got to be patient. You got to wait for the benefits to show up. Number 2 is these emulsifiers. Some of them you say they aren't even mentioned. So I mean, that's just that to me says go buy vegetables and start cooking for yourself. But what are there any names of these emulsifiers that we could look for on labels?
Yes. And so the ones that are commonly labeled, and these are the ones usually that are found in dairy or actually in dairy-free. So in a lot of the dairy-free milk nuts or ice creams, you can find it. And one is called carrageenan. And it's actually a family of these emulsifiers that are originally been extracted from seaweed. And for people who are actually especially sensitive to it, it can cause the same problems that I mentioned. And another common emulsifier actually that a lot of people have an issue with and don't realize that's in their toothpaste is sodium lauryl sulfate. And that does the same thing. It's a detergent that helps remove the biofilm, gives you a clean mouth, but at the same time removes that mucous membrane that lines the mouth and opens you up to low-grade inflammation and mouth sores. And so the same thing's kind of happening in the gut. So those are 2 things that we can actually remove very easily is sodium lauryl sulfate from our toothpaste and carrageenan that we can look for that's actually listed.
Amazing. So the realm of genetics, and we talk a lot about diet on this show, so I want to cross over into your second pillar because this is the one most people are interested in, which is reversing aging. And so, we've been talking about this for decades now. Genetics is coming, we're all going to live forever. And now the data is starting to point in a direction where we could actually have some actionable intel. So I would love for you to get into what you've discovered in this anti-aging realm.
Sure. So being a geneticist, of course, I'm always thinking about our lives and the way in which we eat and all the influences from a DNA perspective. And so the first part of the second pillar is really thinking about shifting our thinking to every bite that we're taking to ask the question, what is this doing to our DNA? And so we don't think about a lot of the issues that or toxins that come in our food that are naturally present, especially if they're organic. And so an example is organic celery, which most people would choose over conventional thinking that it's a better choice. But if that organic celery was exposed to insects that munched on it because it wasn't sprayed, the celery plant to survive will produce a chemical called psoralen. And this is a chemical that when we ingest and then are exposed to the sun, actually goes and damages our DNA. And if you start thinking about then everything that we're eating from that perspective. And I kind of, go through the list of what we should and should not be eating to really maintain our DNA, because having DNA that's working well and that's not damaged is what we want for longevity. Because we could be meeting our mark when it comes to an optimal weight, but if we're not taking care of our DNA at the same time, we're not going to have that kind of lifespan to enjoy that new body. And so when it comes back to it, though, the other kind of half of that pillar is how can we turn on our endogenous systems that repair DNA? And of course, one of the easiest ways is through exercise. And so research now is showing that mitochondria, these are kind of the energy powerhouses of the cell, are really good responders to exercise. And so what happens when we intensely exercise, the body then goes through and will prune out the mitochondria that aren't working well and replace them. So it's like almost like you get an upgrade, and the ones that aren't working well are kind of shuttled off and forced to die. And of course, they have their own DNA as well. And this is a way of getting not just a mitochondrial upgrade, but a genetic one as well. Because if our mitochondria is performing optimally metabolically, then we will be as well.
Mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. There's been a lot out recently about how a lot of the toxins in our environment can damage our mitochondria, which brings down our ability to produce energy. But the fact that exercise can actually help us kind of hack into that system, if you will, and get superior genetics coded and pushed is a big one. What kind of exercise? Are we talking about an hour a day, Surgeon General's recommendation type of thing? Are we talking about, full body weightlifting?
Right. So I'm glad that you asked that, because what the research actually is showing is that it needs to be of a high intensity nature. And this is what's been in the news in the last kind of six months to 1 year, which is the high intensity 1 minute to 3 minutes and with a cool down and warm up, of course, period. So it's actually not that long. And the reason is we probably evolved this process to have a signal which is damage from this exercise because it's so intense, which then turns on these endogenous systems of repair that we have within us. So you don't actually need to do, a 1 hour run to get the same benefits. It may just be these kind of short little pulses. And what happens is our body then produces a protein called interleukin 15, which is what is thought to be behind these beneficial effects.
Got it. So when I hear, and I'm thinking for my audience here, when I hear that organic celery might not be good for me, it's scary, right? It's really scary. It's like, oh great, now what the hell? It's like first they said water was good, then they said the sun wasn't good. And so how can I think about this? And I know you've listed out some of this. How can we think about how this would affect us personally so that we could actually have a way to layer this into our lives?
Well, the most important thing is really to move away from fear-based nutrition, is to employ something that I call mono eating. And I say, sorry, do not employ mono eating. And the reason is, if you're just really limiting yourself to a few types of foods, you would be increasing your exposure to the negative aspects and not the benefits. So if you're just having organic celery and you're having a lot of it constantly all year around, you're then going to be running into trouble. But we really evolved to have a variety number of foods and to eat with the seasons. And in that way, we would always make sure, from an evolutionary perspective, not to get too much of one nutrient and kind of move on to the next food. And really by employing that and taking into our bodies whole foods and fruits and vegetables, we'd be avoiding a lot of these toxins in a very natural way. But I guess, the frustration, especially as a physician, when I would see a lot of my patients that would just focus on a few fruits and vegetables and say, they say, I'm eating healthy, I'm having a bowl of blueberries every single day. And so part of the education was to tell them, yes, blueberries, are healthy and they're loaded with antioxidants and phytonutrients. But if that's all you're consuming, you're overdoing it and you're missing out on all the other nutrients that are available. And it doesn't matter what you're going to be consuming, water will do the same thing. Anything can become toxic if that becomes, your only kind of mono eating.
That's interesting. So, I mean, if blueberries are information and we can liken them to, say, a romance novel, then you're just reading romance novels. You're never going to learn anything else. And so, yeah, I see this with my kids, right? Like my son, you see what he likes. And so you're like, oh, great, that worked. And so you just keep trying to give him that thing, and you have to get out of that habit because we're all just big kids at this point.
And big kids that are busy too, right? So it's exactly what you're saying. You have your 5 dishes and you keep cycling through them. But the idea is to kind of try to expand our cuisine from that perspective as much as possible.
I love that. Now, your third pillar to me is interesting because I love this flavor, the fifth taste, which is umami. I think that, umami's gotten a bad rap with MSG and all this, and so a lot of people avoid it just because of the MSG. But you're saying that it's a crucial weapon in this DNA restart, and I'd love for you to explain that.
Sure. And so this really came out of my own personal experience. I'd find myself on a late call at the hospital, hungry, and very easily going through an entire big family-sized bag of pretzels without end, and actually not feeling satiated at the end of it, actually, and feeling actually a little bit disgusted. And so I started thinking, from an evolutionary perspective, what is it that drives satiety? What is it that makes us feel not just full? Because you can actually feel physiologically full. You can inflate a balloon in your stomach, but you don't feel satiated. You're actually still hungry. And what my research has shown is that, that we're after amino acids. We're actually after essential amino acids in our diet, and we need those to survive. So that's what's kind of causes us to feel satiated. And so umami is driven by the taste of glutamate. And it's good that you mentioned MSG. The umami that I'm after really is the one that's naturally present in our food. And so through fire and fermentation, humans really are the only animals that have unlocked umami in their food, because that's what you need to release these amino acids. And so, a raw piece of meat has very little umami, but you age it or you barbecue it and those proteins get shattered and you start tasting umami comes out. And so what I started thinking was, could we use this flavor, this fifth taste that leads to satiety, to get us feeling full faster and keep us there for longer? And it turns out there's actually many vegetables and fruits, and for example, tomatoes, that fool us into thinking that there's a lot of amino acids. Tomatoes aren't protein rich, but they do that because they want us to eat the fruit and then spread the seeds. And so by employing more tomatoes in our diet and tomato paste, for example, we can get full faster with eating a lot less calories. And it also helps us to understand why tomatoes are so ubiquitous in all kind of cuisines around the world. They really increase flavor. And when you think about umami also, the easy way to think about it is in soups. So every culture developed a soup because it was really famine food, right? You're eating water and you're trying to get full on water. And so the basis of natural soup stock, before we had any of the kind of chemical bouillon or powdered form, was umami. So we're talking fish bones, chicken, and to create a delicious stock, and different vegetables that are rich in umami, such as tomatoes and onions. And so I give in the book all kinds of techniques to increase the umami quotient to get you feeling satiated for longer. And some of them are very simple. So it's if you're making a tomato sauce for a certain dish and you want to increase that quotient, what you can do is add, say, a pea-size amount of anchovy paste, and that's below the level of detection. You're not even tasting any kind of fishy taste, but because there's so much umami and it works synergistically together with the tomato to get you feeling full and that savory feeling in your mouth. And that's one of the reasons that Japanese food has been so popular, because Japanese food in particular is very heavy in umami while lower in calories. And so using many of these techniques, and some of them are counterintuitive because some people are trying to lower their caloric intake, so they skip on the Parmesan cheese. But by adding a teaspoon of Parmesan cheese, which is very high in glutamate, it could actually lead you to feeling satiated quicker. So you can actually end up eating less by taking in that umami at the right time.
That's great. I was just at a dinner party where we were talking about this, and some Korean friends talking about how they always start with soup, and the soup has that umami flavor. And so now your pressure sensors in your stomach, have been expanded anyways. You have the umami, and then when dinner rolls around, you're not pigging out. You're much more conscious of your caloric intake, and that's especially in America, man. We just overeat.
We totally do. And one of the techniques that they do in Japan is they say, before you go up to get seconds or forget about even getting thirds, have another bowl of miso soup. And miso soup is an example of what you're mentioning, which is a very umami-rich broth because it's made from soy that's been digested through fermentation and has all that umami released. And so that helps to get you feeling satiated and stops you from kind of going for seconds and thirds as well.
Just to be super clear on this, because I know there's a lot of trepidation out there about MSG and all that. How about you just help us understand what is MSG in relation to this, and how can we make sure we're avoiding that while getting the umami flavor?
So MSG is glutamate in a salt form, and it was actually discovered originally from comb more than 100 years ago, and that's a giant kind of seaweed, if you can imagine it. And so if you dry that out, you can then get little flakes of MSG off of it. And so, and it increased in popularity when the industrialization and processed foods really took off. But what I'm encouraging people is to move away from all types of processed foods and to get their umami and their glutamate in a natural kind of form. And you don't also need glutamate to get umami. You can get it from 5-ribonucleic acids. And those are guanylate and inositol. And one kind of food source that's very rich in umami, it doesn't have glutamate, is actually shiitake mushrooms. And so many cuisines that were developed to be, for religious reasons, actually to be developed vegan, people used these mushrooms because they were so high in umami, and they would leave you feeling satiated when you were just having a vegetable dish.
Great. That's a big deal, because a lot of the discourse out there right now is eat fat, eat fat, eat fat for satiety, and this umami angle hasn't really been spoken about. And so I think it's very interesting. It's fresh, and it really helps us understand why culturally. I mean, you look at Japanese; they're not known for their obesity unless you're talking about sumo.
Yeah, and exactly. And one of the reasons that they had to rely on umami was their cuisine didn't really have a lot of fat sources. When you think about Japanese cuisine, they didn't have the nut oils, the seed oils, and sources of animal fat. And seafood is not particularly high naturally in fat. So what they had to rely on, they had to come up with another way to get you feel satiated. And it's the real way that triggers, you almost think of it as a genetic satiation, is through umami. And not really through the fat route.
Yeah. So you got to work with what you got. One of the other things that they had was kind of central to their culture, and especially over the pond in China, is tea. And so you mentioned in your fourth pillar the oolong tea, and how potentially that is kind of this amazing genetic unlock. So that's something that I don't really read about that often.
Yeah, and so for me, I've always been interested in tea. I spent a year actually living in Japan, where I drank a lot of green tea. And green tea, of course, people know is very full of polyphenols and has antioxidants and is very healthy. The issue is, for a lot of people, myself included, it could be very irritating. And the reason is, tea plants, like I was mentioning before, all plants don't want to be picked, don't want to have their leaves damaged. And to produce green tea, they actually run, you imagine a giant lawnmower that's attached to a vacuum cleaner that just kind of shreds the leaves off the top, and they blanch it right away, dry it, and then it's ready for drinking. And so the leaves themselves have antifeedants. These are chemicals that stop animals from eating it that are irritant. And so most people who drink a lot of green tea start getting gastritis, like a gut irritation. And so this has been known actually for about 500-600 years in Asia. And one of the ways in which to get around this was to either ferment or let the tea leaves oxidize. So they go through a browning kind of process. It's actually very labor intensive and can take up to 36 to 48 hours. And then you end up with an oolong tea. And so an oolong tea could be fermented, or sorry, oxidized from anywhere between about 20 to 80%. And you imagine green tea is 0%, black tea is at about 100. And so it turns out that initially people thought, well, if you're going to oxidize it, you're going to have less antioxidants. It turns out oolong tea is actually the richest polyphenol source of all the teas, and you don't get gastritis. And so I started really encouraging people to increase their consumption of oolong tea because it's calorie-free, which is important, and it has a few real key features. One is that it binds dietary fat. And so some of these phytonutrients that are found naturally in it kind of bind the fat, and then the fat passes through you. And then another one is research now has shown that it can kind of help shift the microbiome in a positive direction. And most importantly, it's also been shown to target visceral or abdominal fat. So, altogether, it's really exciting when you think about something that's available, that's calorie-free, that everyone really could drink without issue. And so even people who are sensitive to caffeine, there are types of oolongs that have been roasted, and the roasting process actually reduces the amount of caffeine. And so as long as you're not drinking it after 2 or 4 p.m., if you're sensitive, you'll be all right. But the key thing is, and this is what's practiced already for thousands of years in Asia, is to drink your tea while you're eating. And that's really to get the benefits, especially with that natural fat binding benefit that comes along with consuming it.
It's funny, you look at all of these fads that come out and all these pills that people are rushing to buy all the time, and it's all about fat absorption, fat binding. And so there's this natural tea that's been around for thousands of years that helps do that, has all the polyphenols, does all the good stuff, and all you got to do is drink it along with your meal.
Exactly. And the reason that I like it is for the very reasons that you're mentioning now, that it's not an extract as well. This is something that is a whole food. It's a plant that's been treated in a certain way, and you're just drinking an extract of it.
So we take this leaf from the green tea leaf, and then you allow it to, you said oxidize and ferment. Does it ferment a little bit as well?
It can. And so some of the fermentation will give you a different kind of tea called pu'er, but most of the oolongs that are formed, it's actually oxidation. And so you can imagine the same thing, enzymatic browning that happens in a banana peel when it goes black. And the kind of interesting thing is that it's not just green tea that can be irritant. Black tea has the same effect as well, because many of these polyphenols end up kind of joining up in long chains that then become irritating to the gut. And that's part of the tradition of adding milk to black tea, was to make it less irritant. But by doing that, you're actually binding out a lot of the kind of positive phytonutrients that are found in it. And so the other thing is, if you're going to be drinking oolong, drink it without milk, so then you can really absorb all those good compounds.
Amazing. There's also a ritual to it, which leads into your fifth pillar, which you call slow living. Tea is such a wonderful tradition where you sit, you enjoy a cup, you have a conversation, you discuss, you slow down. And not only does it have all these health benefits, it helps you slow down and take time out of life. And so of all the things that you could talk about, you're talking about slowing down in the modern world and how important that is for DNA. So let's get into that. Taking that second to kind of really ground yourself, if it's through a meditative practice or brewing yourself a cup of tea, really helps to bring yourself and also your genetics in line to about what you're going to be doing, which is eating. And so over really millions of years, since kind of, we discovered fire and then started cooking, fermenting our foods, we spent most of our time preparing food. And so through modern conveniences, we kind of skipped over this step. And so what we're doing is, when we do that constantly, we're short-circuiting our natural genetic metabolic process of digestion. And many people actually experience the positive side of this when they take longer to actually eat. When they're preparing their food over an hour or two, by the time they actually sit down to eat, even if they haven't been snacking along the way, they'll find themselves less hungry. And that's because they brought their body really in line with what they're about to do, which is to eat. And so what I advocate is to try to slow down and have a slow meal at least once a week. And what does this really just entail is to stop doing what
all of us really are guilty of doing, which is get rid of our phones. So have a meal that's completely screen-free. Have it with either friends or family or both, and try to really ritualize the whole process. And another kind of thing that I encourage is first bite, last bite. And so what that is, it's actually very simple. It's before taking your first bite is wait 30 seconds. You actually can't imagine how challenging this is for some people, myself included. You have the plate of food, you're ready to go. But what that really does is it allows all these processes, like we were talking about before, saliva, digestion, to come online right before we start to actually eat. And the last bite exercise is to save a single little bite at the end of the meal and wait 30 seconds before you have that. And these kind of little simple techniques really help to bring ourselves in line with our genetics and our digestion and to slow us down. And just doing that, employing that meal once a week will help us carry it over throughout the week as well. And I think really ground us, and we'll find that we'll cut down a lot of mindless eating.
A lot of this is sage wisdom that, say, Grandpa would have told you, and it's like, what does Grandpa know? We're all so damn busy, Grandpa. Can't you see I've got a job, right? And now, so here we are talking to a geneticist who's talking Grandpa's language in some ways too. And so, how much of this is just pointing back to the wisdom of the ancients in a way where they understood how our physiology worked, and our DNA is still very much firing along those lines, and so some things you just can't short circuit.
That's right. And so really what genetics, and especially cutting edge genetics, does, it opens ourselves up to wisdom of the ages. Because if you really think about it, all the genetic wisdom within us took millions of years of trial and error and success to happen, because every one of our ancestors had to succeed and overcome some type of serious challenge to survive. And then they passed on that genetic wisdom to us. So really all I'm encouraging is to open ourselves up, to start reading our own genetic book and start living by it.
I love that. In a world where I have friends and colleagues flying to Mexico to get stem cells injected, and everyone's talking about AI and enhanced things and blah. We're talking here about slowing down, eating umami, and drinking oolong tea. It's great. It's really heartwarming to see how this conversation is forming, and how kind of the tried and true science is still pointing to good, healthy living, and just making some decisions based on personal medicine instead of blanket advice that you're getting from the tabloids. Yep. So book comes out soon, and what's the title of the book? I want to make sure, and I'm actually going to test some of your recipes with my audience here. I think it's great. I think applying umami to a diet and just kind of building it into how you cook is huge. So I'll do this along with my audience, but tell us where we can find the book.
Wonderful. So the book's called The DNA Restart, and of course is available everywhere that they sell great books.
Yeah, great. And you're published by Rodale, who's a wonderful, wonderful house. We just had Maria Rodale in our upcoming movie, and they're just, they invented organic. It's a great publishing house. So, Dr. Sharon Moalem, thank you so much. Again, the book is called The DNA Restart. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how my audience sparks to this and starts using some of these recipes. And I thank you for the work that you've been doing.
Great. Thanks for having me.